Have you ever imagined living in a place where time simply stops, where every second carries the weight of death, and the sound of a clock can announce the end of another life? Well, that's exactly what happened in a small, quiet town called New Haven in Connecticut. A seemingly ordinary place, hidden among quiet streets and old houses, but which held such a dark secret that for years no one dared even cross its sidewalk. They say that inside that house, time had a mind of its own. That the hands turned according to something science has never been able to explain. And the most frightening thing, with each murder, the clock on the main wall stopped, always at the same time. 7 in the morning, not a minute more, not a second less. And what you're about to discover may surprise you. The first stories emerged in the early 1980s. Neighbors spoke of muffled screams in the early hours of the morning. Others swore they could hear the maddening ticking of the clock right outside their house, as if it were trying to warn them of something. The sound, metallic and constant, seemed to echo off the walls, and many said it would speed up just before each tragedy. It was as if the clock knew when death was approaching. Coincidence? Or something far more disturbing? As the years passed, rumors turned to fear. The number of victims increased, and no one could understand what was really happening inside that house. 7 people died between 1982 and 1991, all under nearly identical circumstances. And in every case, the clock stopped, always in the same place, always at the same time. Most intriguingly, researchers were never able to find any mechanical faults in the object. No loose wires, no defects, no reason for time to freeze, except for one: someone was stopping it. Now imagine the despair of an entire city living under this shadow. Families abandoned their homes, businesses closed their doors, and even police officers began refusing to enter the premises after sunset. A simple ticking became a cursed sound, a constant reminder that evil sometimes doesn't need to scream. It just marks the time. Have you ever been in a place that gave you chills for no apparent reason? That kind of feeling that makes you look back even though you know no one's there? Well, for the residents of New Haven, that feeling has never gone away. Many swear that even today, when the wind blows from the north, they can hear the distant echo of a clock trying to tick, the same one that stopped at the exact moment the last body was found. Stay with me until the end, because understanding what really happened in this house can completely change the way you view time, destiny, and even fear. The story you're about to hear isn't just about crime, it's about coincidences that defy logic, about the human obsession with controlling the impossible, and about a clock that may never have measured time, but rather the lives it took. Some call it a curse. Others say it was the work of a brilliant and ruthless killer, someone who knew exactly what he was doing. But there are those who believe that in that house, time wasn't an enemy, it was an accomplice. What if I told you that the clock is moving again after decades of silence? Well, that's where the real story begins. Do you believe that a simple clock can predict death? That its hands, as they turn silently, carry a secret capable of announcing the exact moment a life will be taken? Well, that's exactly what happened in New Haven, a small town in the state of Connecticut in the United States, a place known for its tree-lined streets, its peaceful atmosphere, and for a period of almost a decade, for the fear that settled on every corner. It all started in 1982, when the first victim was found dead inside an old two-story house on the outskirts of the city. A woman named Margaret Lowell, 42, a music teacher, known by everyone as calm and generous. She lived alone, and that morning was found collapsed next to the stairs. Her body showed no signs of a struggle. The house was intact, and nothing seemed out of place, except for one detail that would leave investigators unanswered for years. The clock on the main wall had stopped exactly at 3:07 a.m. At first, no one paid any attention. It could have been a coincidence, right? A mechanical defect, perhaps. But fate, or something no one has ever been able to explain, proved otherwise. Because in the following years, other people would die in the same house. And the clock would always stop at the same time. 7 deaths between 1982 and 1991. 7 interrupted stories. 7 hands frozen at 3:07. The second victim was a 23-year-old man, Thomas Baird, who had moved into the house a few months after the first incident. He was an engineering student and, according to police records, was found dead sitting on the sofa, his face turned toward the clock. No sign of a break-in, no signs of violence, just the same silence and the same stillness of time. And that's when the case began to attract the attention not only of local police, but also of investigators from across the state. The newspapers began reporting what they called the house where time stood still. New Haven residents began avoiding the street, and even mailmen refused to make deliveries there. Some claimed to see lights flickering inside the abandoned house. Others swore they heard the ticking echoing even outside, as if the clock was still alive, waiting for its next victim. And the strangest thing, no one could explain why people kept entering the house, even though they knew what had happened before. As the years passed, fear turned to morbid curiosity. Investigators, journalists, and even criminology students visited the scene in search of answers. The deaths seemed random, men and women of different ages, with no apparent connection. But one thing caught the experts' attention. At every scene, the wall clock, an old model made in the 1940s, remained intact but stopped at the same time. Replacing it was pointless. The police tried to replace it, but the new clock also stopped at exactly 3:07 a.m. Can you imagine what it would be like to live in a city where the mere sound of a clock evokes dread? Where every chime of the night makes people hold their breath, hoping nothing will happen? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you, and perhaps make you look at your home clock differently. The story of New Haven mystery. It's not just about unexplained deaths. It's about the fear of the unknown, about time that insists on repeating the same fate, and about a house that seems alive, breathing between walls that hold secrets no one has ever been able to decipher. And most disturbing of all, after so many years of silence, some say the clock has started moving again, and this time it won't stop anytime soon. Have you ever lived in a place where fear seemed to breathe within the walls, where every sound in the early morning made your heart race, not because something was happening, but because everyone knew something was happening? I would go happen. Because that's exactly how the residents of New Haven in Connecticut described the years when terror gripped the town. All because of one house. A seemingly ordinary house, but one that hid a secret so deep that to this day no one can fully explain it. After the third death, no one believed in coincidence anymore. With each new body found inside the house, panic spread like an invisible poison. Entire families began to move. Neighbors who once greeted each other on the porch now crossed the street in silence. The windows remained closed, the lights were on all night, and even the puppies seemed restless. The house clock, the same one that always stopped at 3:07 a.m., became a symbol of terror, and also the center of all conversations. They said that he stopped alone seconds before the crime happened. The ticking sound accelerated, as if the clock were trying to warn that something terrible was about to happen. Some residents swore they could hear the sound from a distance, even though they lived blocks away. Others said that on colder mornings, the hour hand simply disappeared, and when it did, they knew another person would die. The police of New Haven tried to calm the population, but with each inconclusive investigation, fear only grew. In a small town where everyone knew each other, distrust became commonplace. Friends began to suspect each other, and worst of all, no one knew who would be next. It was in this climate of paranoia that the first name to circulate among the neighbors was that of Arthur Bell, a retired watchmaker who lived 2 blocks from the house. Solitary, eccentric, and obsessed with antique clocks, Arthur was often seen strolling the street at night, gazing out the window of the cursed house. Some swore they heard laughter coming from his workshop in the early hours of the morning. When the police questioned him, they found dozens of clocks standing still on his shelves, and they all showed the same time. 07. But Arthur denied any involvement, and since there was no concrete evidence, he was released. Even so, suspicion remained. The public began to treat him like a living ghost. He avoided leaving his home, and his store, once frequented by the entire neighborhood, was closed forever. Still, the murders continued. It was then that the darker theories began. Some believed the house was cursed, built on an ancient Native American burial ground. Others claimed the clock had belonged to a serial killer who had died inside the house decades earlier, and that his soul remained there, controlling time and choosing new victims. Local radio stations mercilessly explored the case. Newspapers ran sensational headlines, and New Haven, a once quiet town, became a stage for mass hysteria. Can you imagine living with that kind of fear, knowing that a simple sound, the ticking of a clock, could herald your own death? Some families began keeping time differently, hiding clocks, turning off alarms, trying to escape something no one saw, but everyone felt. Local authorities tried to maintain order, but chaos had already set in. There were nights when police patrols would park in front of the house just to ensure nothing happened. Even so, the impossible kept happening. And it was during one of those early mornings, while the wind blew hard and the entire city seemed to hold its breath, that the clock stopped again. At 3:07 a.m., once again, another victim. Stay with me until the end, because what came after that night turned fear into despair and made researchers realize that the real culprit might not be human. Do you believe that a simple clock could hide a secret capable of revealing a killer? That a seemingly ordinary object hanging on an old wall could be the key to deciphering a series of mysterious deaths? Well, that's exactly what investigators knew. Even they became suspicious when they realized that in all the crimes, the clock in the house stopped at the same time. 7 a.m., not a second before, not a second after. And most disturbing of all, it was never broken. For nearly a decade, that house was the scene of 7 unexplained deaths. The victims had no apparent connection, and the crime scenes seemed repetitive, as if the killer were reenacting the same act over and over again. But when the forensic team turned their attention to the clock, a pattern began to emerge. And what they discovered next turned the case into one of the greatest criminal mysteries in Connecticut history. It all started when the detective Michael Hanlon, the third person in charge of the investigation, decided to test a hypothesis. He ordered the clock to be collected after the 7th murder, a wall clock dating back to 1943 with a self-winding mechanism and bronze hands. The forensic team took the object to the police department laboratory and spent weeks trying to understand what made it always stop at the same time. No defects were found, no electrical faults, no external interference. The clock was perfect, but someone had tampered with it, manually restarted every time. This discovery completely changed the course of the investigation. It meant someone was present at every crime scene, someone who tampered with the watch on purpose, perhaps as a signature, a ritual, or even a provocation to the police. Newspapers began calling the killer the watchmaker of New Haven, and the case became a national obsession. Have you ever noticed how certain objects carry a strange energy, as if they were witnessing things we can't see? Stay with me until the end, because what happened after this discovery will leave you wondering what is coincidence and what is absolute control of time. As researchers delved deeper into their analysis, other coincidences began to emerge. All the crimes occurred on nights with a full moon, all between a Friday and a Saturday. And in every scene the clock stopped, but the rest of the house remained intact. Glasses half empty, lamps lit, curtains drawn, as if time truly froze within that space, only to resume when death had already served its purpose. Hanlon, a methodical and skeptical detective, rejected any supernatural explanation. He believed the clock was a code, a form of communication between the killer and himself. He had cameras, motion sensors, and even microphones installed inside the house. But nothing happened. The clock stood still for weeks, until one day, November 12th, 1991, at 3:07 a.m., all the equipment failed simultaneously. And when the team arrived in the morning, there was another victim. It was at this point that fear mingled with obsession. Hanlon began sleeping inside his own house, trying to catch the killer in action. He spent the early mornings watching the clock, noting every sound, every vibration, every shadow that moved down the hallway. And one night, he swears he heard something, the soft sound of a string being turned, as if someone right next to him were winding the clock again. Do you believe in coincidences? Or do you think there's something or someone controlling time in ways we can't understand? What you're about to discover could completely change your mind about this case and about the true role of that clock in the series of murders. Because when the experts finally cracked open the mechanism, they found something no one has ever been able to explain. Have you ever met someone who seemed to live in another time? Someone whose presence made the room slow down, as if the air itself hesitated to move? In New Haven, this someone had a name, Arthur Bell. An ordinary man in the eyes of those who saw him passing by on the street, but who, for many, was the true person responsible for one of the most disturbing cases in the city's history. The case of the clock that stopped after each murder. Arthur lived just a few meters from The house where 7 people died between 1982 and 1991. He was a retired watchmaker, known for the almost supernatural patience with which he disassembled and reassembled tiny gears. He spent hours in absolute silence, hunched over his workbench, surrounded by dozens of clocks, wristwatches and pocket watches, all different, all stopped, and curiously, almost all of them showing the same time. 7 a.m. When police began investigating the string of deaths, Arthur was the first name to surface. Among residents, a lonely man without family who lived surrounded by instruments capable of measuring and manipulating time. There was something unsettling about him, his distant gaze, his slow speech, the precision with which he described each of the models he collected, and most importantly, the fact that he never seemed to sleep. Neighbors claimed to see lights on in his workshop until dawn, the sound of the hands echoing outside like a never-ending mechanical symphony. But what few knew is that Arthur Bell had a past as fractured as the clocks he repaired. As a young man, he had worked in a factory making timekeeping instruments for the American military. There, he developed an obsession with synchronicity, the idea that all events in the world could be connected by a single invisible pulse, a rhythm that dictated people's destinies. He believed that if he could understand this secret rhythm, he could predict or even control the exact moment something would happen. This fixation intensified after a personal tragedy. His wife, Eleanor, died in a fire that destroyed the watch shop they both ran together. According to reports, Arthur managed to escape, but spent days catatonic, repeating the same phrase. Her watch stopped at 3:07. Since then, he was never the same. He stopped serving clients, isolated himself from the world, and began collecting antique clocks, each representing, as he himself put it, a stolen moment of time. When the crimes began, everything seemed to fit together. The deaths, the identical time of day, the proximity of the house, the watchmaker's strange behavior. But what baffled investigators was the complete lack of evidence. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no records directly linking him to the victims. Still, there was something deeply unsettling about being face to face with him. Detective Michael Hanlon, the same person leading the investigation, described the first interview as the feeling of talking to someone who knew exactly what you were going to ask before you opened your mouth. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, even in absolute silence? That someone knew more than they let on? That's exactly how the police officers felt as they left Arthur Bell's house. As they gathered their notes, the sound of a clock echoed behind them, tic-tac rhythmic, perfect, almost hypnotic. And when they looked back, Arthur just smiled. Time is the only thing that never lies, he said. Stay with me until the end, because what happened after that encounter changed everything the police thought they knew about the case. What seemed like just a series of coincidences began to reveal a pattern so precise, so mathematical, it was impossible to ignore. And for the first time, the investigation realized that perhaps Arthur Bell wasn't just a suspect, but the man who truly controlled the time. Have you ever witnessed the exact moment when silence seems to swallow the world? That instant when even the sound of your own heart seems to stop, as if time has decided to pause. That's exactly what the police officers of New Haven, they said they felt it when they last entered the house. The clock on the wall was still ticking, the hands slowly sliding, and then, in front of everyone, it simply stopped. alone. At 3:07 a.m., this would be the last time the clock would strike a death. The house was plunged into a heavy silence, the kind of silence that carries memories, fear, and something that seems to breathe on its own. On the floor, the body of Arthur Bell, the clockmaker, lay in a strangely serene position, as if he had fallen asleep amidst the chaos he himself had created. No one immediately understood what had happened. There were no signs of a struggle, no traces of violence. Just the old clock still hanging on the wall, its hands vibrating gently, and then the final sound. Tick, tack, and the void. For years, Arthur Bell's name had divided the city. To some, he was the killer who played with time and people's lives. To others, simply a tormented man, obsessed with understanding what no one else dared to study. When police found his body next to the main clock, many believed the cycle had finally ended. But what forensics uncovered in the following hours would leave everyone even more confused. Inside the house, dozens of clocks were scattered throughout the rooms, on shelves, walls, even the floor, all stopped at the same time, all with their mechanisms intact, as if someone had deliberately stopped. Time. And in the center of Arthur's workbench sat a notebook with a handwritten sentence: "Time doesn't kill, it just observes." Have you ever had the feeling that some stories just don't want to be explained? That certain places carry something that won't go away, even when everything seems over? Well, that's how New Haven felt after that night. A small town, accustomed to the calm rhythm of everyday life, now bore an invisible scar. No one spoke openly about the house anymore. The windows were boarded up, the address erased from public records, and any attempt at further investigation was met with resistance. But the strangest thing is that, even after all, residents continued to hear the sound of the clock, sometimes faint, sometimes insistent, always at the same time. 3:07 in the morning. It was as if the sound echoed off the city walls, reminding everyone that time somehow was still watching. The detective Michael Hanlon, who followed the case until the end, said in an interview that he could never forget that sound. He described the moment he entered the room and saw the clock's hand trembling, not as if it were a malfunction, but as if something invisible had given it one last push before everything stopped. It was as if the clock knew it was being watched, he said, and only then did it decide to stop. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. The case was officially closed as a natural death, but there are details that have never been released to the public. Reports were lost, recordings were erased, and an object missing from the crime scene, the small pocket watch Arthur always carried with him. And this is where the story takes an even more disturbing turn, because, weeks later, a resident of another town, more than 50 miles away, reported finding an identical clock, stopped exactly at 3:07. Have you ever wondered if time really passes the same way for everyone? Or if, in certain places, it just stops existing? Sometimes it feels like seconds stretch out like hours, and hours disappear without a trace. But what if I told you that, in a small town called New Haven, time not only slowed down, it stopped completely every time someone died? For nearly a decade, residents of this town lived under the sound of a clock that seemed to have a life of its own. A clock that obeyed neither the laws of physics nor reason. With each murder, it froze in place. 7 a.m. It didn't matter the day. the victim, or the circumstances. Always the same time, the same silence, the same feeling that time had been ripped from reality. Now imagine living in a place like that, where every chime of the night is a reminder that you might be next, where the simple sound of attic-tacket awakens the most primal fear there is, that of losing control of time, and along with it, control of one's life. Have you ever felt something like this? That sensation that the world around you keeps spinning, but something inside you is trapped in a moment that never ends. The story of Arthur Bell, the New Haven clockmaker, isn't just about crime and mystery. It's a reflection on what happens when someone tries to master the uncontrollable. Arthur believed that time had a will of its own, that each second was a living entity, capable of choosing when to begin and when to end. And perhaps, deep down, he was right. Authorities closed the case more than 30 years ago, but the mystery remains. No one has been able to explain why all the clocks in the house stopped at exactly the same time, or why, even after Arthur's death, the sound of the clock still echoed through the empty streets of New Haven. Some say it's the wind knocking against the windows. Others swear they still hear it, tick-tack every morning, coming from inside the sealed house. The most disturbing thing is that this isn't an isolated phenomenon. Similar cases have been reported in other parts of the world, clocks that stop the moment. Someone dies, hands that start moving again on their own, clocks that tell the exact time of tragic events days before they happen. Coincidence? Maybe, but maybe not. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. This story makes us question to what extent time is something we measure, or something that measures us. Does it truly flow steadily, or does it simply refuse to move forward in certain places? In New Haven, the house clock was removed and stored as evidence. Years later, it was displayed in a small local museum, and the strangest part, even though it's not working, visitors claim to hear a faint rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. Tick, tack, tick, tack. Some leave there swearing that the hand moved, for a second, just a second, exactly when the clock said 7. So I ask you, did time really stop? Or did someone know exactly when to do so? If this story gave you goosebumps, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments, would you believe in such a coincidence? Or do you think the clock knew more than it seemed? Because maybe, just maybe, time doesn't pass. It just observes. Perhaps what's most frightening about this story isn't the clock that stopped, nor the deaths it seemed to portend, but the feeling that somehow time is also watching us. It watches us run, sees us promise that tomorrow will be different, and when we least expect it, it simply stops. It's strange to think about, isn't it? Because deep down, we all have a clock we keep inside our minds, that moment we never forget, that memory that seems frozen, as if the hands of life had decided not to move forward. And that's why stories like this resonate so deeply with us. They're not just about crimes, mysteries, or coincidences. They're about the fear of losing control of what's most precious, time. It's about realizing that sometimes it behaves unpredictably, especially when it has something it wants to show us. If this topic makes sense to you, if at any point in this story you felt that chill or remembered something you can't explain, leave it here in the comments. What touched you most? I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this, whether you believe the clock really stopped due to something supernatural, or whether you think there's an explanation that hasn't yet been discovered. It's your perspective on this story that keeps this community going, and every comment helps keep this conversation alive, even after the video ends. And if you like to dive into this kind of mystery, to feel that time stops for a few minutes while you listen to real and inexplicable stories, like this video, it seems like a simple gesture, but it makes a huge difference. It's what helps the channel continue, reaching more people who also seek to understand the darker and more fascinating side of reality. Oh, and if you've made it this far and aren't part of this community yet, subscribe to the channel, because every story I tell here is made for those who, like you, are curious about what lies in the shadows, about what science cannot yet explain. And I want to have you with me in the next ones. Time may even try to deceive us, but as long as you're here, hanging on every word, it has no power. And speaking of time, stay with me, because what comes next might make you see this New Haven case in a new light. Have you ever had the feeling that time behaves strangely in certain places, as if something invisible controlled every second, deciding when it should speed up or stop completely? Well, that was exactly the feeling the residents of New Haven, a small town in rural Connecticut, experienced when they realized that in their house, time didn't flow like it does in any other. It simply died. It all began with an almost innocent sound, the steady ticking of an antique clock hanging on the wall of the main living room. A sound that should have represented order, routine, the natural passage of time. But there, inside that house, that same sound became the harbinger of chaos. The clock didn't just keep time, it interrupted it, always at the same point, always at the same instant, 3:07 a.m. And every time the hand stopped, someone died. Imagine living in a place like that. People said the air inside the house was thicker, as if it were difficult to breathe. The silence seemed heavy. And when night fell, a collective fear gripped the streets. Doors locked, windows closed, dogs restless, children being rushed indoors. No one wanted to hear that sound, the distant echo of a clock that seemed to mark not time, but destiny. The first victim was found in 1982, and no one knew what to think. A lone woman collapsed near the stairs, with no signs of a struggle, no marks on her body. The police believed it was a domestic accident, a fatal stumble, until they noticed the detail. The clock had stopped minutes earlier. A mechanical defect, perhaps. It was the most logical thing to do. But what happened next showed that logic had no place in that story. In the following years, other deaths occurred, all inside the same house, all at 3:07 a.m. The victims were unrelated. Young people, elderly people, couples, temporary tenants, all swept up in the same impossible-to-ignore pattern. And each time the police tried to offer an explanation, something new emerged to defy reasoning. It was as if the house, or time itself, mocked those who tried to understand. Over the years, the case began to turn into legend. Some said the clock had been made by a cursed watchmaker who had committed suicide after losing his family in a fire. Others swore the object had been used in magical rituals and that each beat represented a trapped soul. But there were also those who believed in something more rational, a sequence of tragic coincidences fueled by small-town superstition. Still, the fear was real. There was a strange energy surrounding the house. Even the wind felt different when it passed through, as if the air carried memories of something never explained. People reported hearing footsteps, voices, and even the sound of a rope being turned, as if someone was still there, winding the clock to make sure it would stop again. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because behind this whole story, there's something bigger than fear. There's a question many avoid asking: what happens when time becomes conscious? Does it also feel pain, anger, jealousy? Could time exact revenge on those who try to control it? The New Haven house seemed alive. Witnesses said the walls seemed to pulse, the floor vibrated slightly before each tragedy, as if the clock were merely an intermediary between two worlds. Researchers began to realize that the object wasn't simply stopping, it was manually restarted, seconds before death occurred. This meant there was someone inside, watching, waiting, and choosing exactly when time should stop. This detail changed everything. The case ceased to be a mere mystery and became an obsession. The clock's sound, which had previously been merely disturbing, became a language, a code. Each tick seemed to conceal a message. The experts tried to decipher it, but with each attempt the clock reacted differently, advancing minutes, losing seconds, stopping earlier than expected. It was as if it were playing a game with its observers, aware of its own importance. Little by little, the house became a symbol, a reminder that there are things human beings cannot control. No matter how hard they try, death, chance, time, everything beyond our control awakens a primal fear, the fear that comes not from visible danger, but from what we cannot comprehend. And this story was no different. It struck a chord because it showed something we all try to deny, that time can be cruel. But the scariest thing is that no one ever saw the clock stop. It simply stopped. 1 second it was there, vibrating, alive. The next, the hand froze, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Witnesses said that in these moments, the sound of the wind ceased, the insects fell silent, and even hearts slowed. It was as if the entire universe respected that instant, the exact second in which time decided to take a life. Behind this story lies a hidden truth, a kind of mirror that reflects the quieter side of human beings, the obsession with controlling the inevitable. We try to measure, predict, calculate. But when something breaks this logic, we are forced to face what truly lies behind. It all, the mystery, the fragility, the fear of not understanding. And perhaps that's why this house continues to fascinate everyone who hears about it. Not just because of the deaths, but because of what it represents. A place where time has lost its way, where reality bows before something that cannot be explained. What if time really could choose? What if, in certain places, it decided to stop just to observe what we've created in its absence? Perhaps that's why, even decades later, passers-by on the old New Haven street still swear they hear the sound that echoes in the early morning, tic-tac distant, almost imperceptible, but carrying a warning. Because time, when it wants to, doesn't need to rush. It just waits. Comment there. That makes sense to me. Have you ever noticed how certain cities hold stories that seem alive, as if they were breathing between the ancient walls and silent streets? New Haven in rural Connecticut was exactly like that, a seemingly peaceful town, almost perfect in appearance, but hiding something deeply disturbing. For years, it lived under the weight of a mystery no one could explain. And it all began inside a single house. It was a house with a simple facade, light wood, small windows, and a garden that, over time, became overgrown. During the day, it seemed like just another residence forgotten by renovations and the rush of the modern world. But at night, it changed. The silence that surrounded it was different. It wasn't the normal silence of a sleepy neighborhood. It was dense, almost physical, as if the air refused to circulate, and it was in this setting that the first deaths occurred. The first case was recorded in 1982. The victim, Margaret Lowell, a 42-year-old music teacher, was found collapsed near the main staircase. There was no sign of forced entry, struggle, or injury. Police treated it as an accident, a stumble perhaps. But what no one noticed yet was the detail that would change everything. The living room clock had stopped exactly at 3:07 a.m. The following year, the house was rented again. A young student named Thomas Baird moved there, believing the stories about his previous death were just superstition. He didn't even stay 3 months. He was found dead on the living room sofa, his body intact, his eyes open and staring at the clock on the wall. The same clock. The same time. 7. It was at this point that police began to notice a pattern. Each new resident who entered the house met the same fate. The deaths continued until 1991, totaling 7 victims, all found exactly at 3:07 a.m., with no plausible medical explanation, no signs of poisoning, suffocation, nothing. It was as if life had simply stopped, like the clock. Over the years, the case gained notoriety. Newspapers began calling the place the house where time stood still, and the story spread far beyond Connecticut. Investigators, curious onlookers, and even paranormal researchers visited the site seeking answers. Some left convinced there was a scientific explanation. Others left vowing never to return. But what was most frightening wasn't just the repetition of deaths, it was their precision. Records showed that all the victims died at the same minute, according to their own wristwatches, alarm clocks, and even the kitchen clock, all stopped at 3:07. And the strangest thing, the experts who analyzed the clock in the main room assured that it never been broken. No mechanical failure. No internal damage. It would simply stop, and then hours later start up again on its own. Authorities tried to justify it in various ways. They talked about electrical disturbances, magnetic faults, and even air currents that interfered with the mechanisms, theories that deep down seemed more like attempts to calm the town than to reveal the truth. Because deep down, everyone felt the same. There was something alive in that house, something watching, something choosing. Over time, the street where the house stood became avoided. Children changed their routes to school. Adults crossed the sidewalk with hurried steps and suspicious looks. The mailman refused to deliver mail there, and surrounding businesses began closing their doors early. New Haven, once known for its cafes and local markets, was now remembered for a single sound, the distant echo of a clock that never struck tomorrow. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what happened in New Haven goes far beyond a police case. It's about mentality of an entire city shaped by fear, about how mystery has the power to transform human behavior. When the inexplicable becomes part of everyday life, people change. They begin to see patterns in everything. A random noise becomes an omen. A delay in the clock becomes a signal. And in New Haven, fear spread like an invisible disease. Residents reported hearing the clock sound even from their own homes, as if its ticking echoed through the wind. Others claimed to see shadows moving behind the curtains of the empty house, even years after it was foreclosed. Under pressure, the police tried to investigate again. But each time they entered, something happened. Flashlights failed, radios crackled, and the air became heavy, suffocating. It was as if time itself were distorted inside, defying all logic, and the more answers were sought, the more questions arose. Some believed there was a hidden truth being hidden, a connection between the victims, perhaps something never revealed in the official reports. Others maintained that the watch was merely a symbol, a physical manifestation of something much deeper, perhaps the reflection of a force that cannot be measured, only felt. Some say the real mystery of New Haven isn't the house, nor the deaths, but the transformation that it caused in people, because somehow all that fear, all that collective tension created a kind of self-consciousness, as if the house, fueled by the city's energy, had come to life. And the curious thing is that even decades later, there are still those who swear the living room clock is still there, intact. That on cold autumn nights, when the wind blows from the north, you can hear the sound of the hands moving for a moment, and then silence. Always the same silence. Comment here. That makes sense to me. Have you ever noticed how fear has the power to transform an entire city? It starts small, almost imperceptible, and as it spreads, it changes people's behavior, altering the way they speak, the way they look at each other, and even the way they breathe. New Haven, that's exactly what happened. After the third death inside that house, no one believed in coincidence anymore. It was as if something invisible had taken over the streets, infiltrated the alleys, and lingered in the heavy air the city breathed. People no longer spoke about the case out loud. They avoided mentioning the house's name, as if uttering those words were the same as summoning it closer. But the topic was everywhere. At cafe, tables, in neighbors' whispers, in newspaper headlines. "The clock stops seconds before the crime," said one of the covers that circulated in 1985. And that was enough to turn fear into hysteria. They said the clock in the main room stopped on its own, seconds before the crime occurred. Some believed the object was cursed. Others swore it was manipulated by someone who enjoyed playing with time and with people. With each new death, the tension grew. No one slept soundly. The sound of a clock in the early hours of the morning, once a common occurrence, now made the blood run cold. Police patrols began to increase in the area. Cars with their sirens off drove slowly down the street where the house stood, as if danger could be seen through the walls. But fear didn't stem from anything visible, it stemmed from uncertainty. People tried to find logic where only absurdity existed, and it was in this void that the first theories, the first suspects, and also the first injustices emerged. The main name in the conversation circles was Arthur Bell, a retired watchmaker who lived 2 blocks from the house. He was known for repairing antique clocks and collecting rare models, many of which stopped at different times. Some kept time exactly 10:07. When this coincidence was discovered, Arthur became the focus of all suspicion. The newspapers started calling him the man who controlled time, a nickname that mingled fear and fascination. He was a solitary man with a quiet voice and a distant, Look, who rarely left his house. Neighbors said he spent his nights awake, with the workshop lights on, tinkering with ancient gears and mechanisms, while the metallic sounds echoed into the early hours. It was easy to point the finger at someone like that. Someone different, reserved, with mysterious habits. When the police finally questioned him, they found more than 50 clocks in his home, all arranged with almost obsessive precision. And yes, several of them were on the clock. 7. Arthur. Explained that it was just a curiosity. Many of the clocks had been purchased at auction and arrived stopped at that same time, which he found strangely beautiful. But the authorities weren't convinced. How could anyone find beauty in something so morbid? Even without concrete evidence, Arthur was treated as guilty. People looked at him with disgust, children crossed the street at the sight of him, and newspapers turned him into a symbol of the evil that haunted New Haven. The city needed a face to blame, someone to place its collective fear on, and he perfectly suited that role. But most disturbingly, even after the investigation, the killings continued, and the clock continued to stop. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because besides fear, there was something else at work in New Haven, the need for control. When the inexplicable arises, humans try to fill the void with explanations, even if they are lies. The community began to create narratives, mixing real fantasies with local legends. They said the house was built on ancient ruins, that the ground was cursed, that the clock had belonged to an exorcist priest who went mad. Each story fueled the next, and the more panic grew, the more the truth became distorted. The churches began to fill. Entire families sought blessings, carried crucifixes, lit candles, and prayed for protection. Some even tried to break the clock, believing it would end the cycle, but no one dared approach the house for long. It was as if it repelled any attempt to interfere. The few who dared enter, police, curious, and investigators, reported strange symptoms: dizziness, shortness of breath, chills. One even fainted inside the living room, right in front of the clock. Meanwhile, journalists transformed the tragedy into a spectacle. Reporters flew in from other states, filmed TV shows, and interviewed frightened residents. Each story seemed to reignite the flame of fear. And New Haven, once synonymous with tranquility, became a city besieged by its own imagination. But there was a difference between fear and truth, and as time passed, a question began to bother those who still dared to study the case. Did the clock stop because someone made it stop, or because it knew when the next death would happen? This doubt loomed large over everything. It transformed the case into something beyond the crime. It became an almost philosophical question. And it's curious how this kind of mystery exposes the most fragile part of us. Our inability to accept what cannot be explained. The people of New Haven wanted answers, but deep down, they feared finding them. Because understanding what was behind that clock meant facing the unimaginable. The city was never the same again. To this day, some residents swear that when they pass the house's old street, they feel the air get colder. Others say they hear attic tack-soft, even without a clock nearby. Maybe it's just the echo of a fear that never went away, or maybe time back in New Haven is still deciding who will be the next to stop. Write it down. I'm on that journey too. As the days passed, the case of the New Haven house seemed to deepen into an endless maze. Fear was no longer just collective. It had become a kind of constant presence, a shadow that followed every resident of the city, even during the day. What had once been mere curiosity had now become a national obsession. Newspapers, magazines, and television channels devoted pages and entire hours trying to decipher the mystery of the clock that always stopped at the same time, 3:07 a.m. The police, under pressure from public opinion, decided to reopen the investigation with greater rigor. New experts were called in, specializing in mechanics, chronology, and even magnetic phenomena. The clock, the very one hanging on the main wall of the house's living room, was carefully removed and taken for analysis. It was an old model, made in the 1940s, with an internal gear-based mechanism and manual winding. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, but there was something about it that defied any technical explanation. Investigators examined it for weeks. No apparent defects, no loose wires, no signs of wear that would explain the stoppages. Most disturbing, however, came a detail no one expected. The experts discovered that the clock had never broken. It was manually reset, seconds before the exact time the deaths occurred. This changed everything, because if it was reset, it meant there was someone inside, someone who knew the precise moment the tragedy would occur. This revelation turned the story around. The house was no longer just a cursed place, but a meticulously planned crime scene. A clock doesn't stop on its own 7 times, always at the same minute, without a human mind behind it. But who would be capable of such precision? And most importantly, why? Detective Michael Hanlon, a man known for his coolness and logical reasoning, took on the case. He believed everything had a rational explanation. Perhaps someone had tampered with the mechanism or used the clock as a sort of symbolic signature for the crimes. It was a pattern, a personal mark. And the more Hanlon investigated, the more he realized the killer seemed to enjoy it. There was something theatrical about every detail. The victims seemed arranged, almost as if they had been positioned in specific places, always in rooms where the clock could be seen. During their search of the house, experts found something even more disturbing: small fingerprints on the inside of the clock case. They were recent, but they didn't belong to any of the residents. And strangest of all, the fingerprints were on the inside of the glass, in a position impossible to reach without disassembling the object. This discovery shattered the team's assumptions and reopened a question no one wanted to address. Was the perpetrator truly human? Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because behind this investigation lay something greater than a simple crime. It was a struggle between reason and the unknown, between what can be proven and what can only be felt. Hanlon, who had always believed in logic, began to change. He began to sleep poorly, hearing imaginary sounds in the early hours of the morning, especially the sound of the clock ticking, even when the clock was kept at the police station. He recorded everything: times, dates, temperature variations, the behavior of the mechanisms, in one. Of his notes, he wrote, "The clock seems to react to human presence. The more we observe it, the more it changes." This sentence, found years later, would become one of the case's most controversial. According to technicians, the clock started ticking on its own inside the evidence room, even though it wasn't wound. This not only defied logic, but also messed with everyone's minds. It was as if the object had consciousness, as if it knew it was being watched. Tests were conducted with motion, sensors, and audio recordings. On one of the tapes at 3:07 a.m., the sound of a slight gear moving was recorded, followed by a barely audible voice, a whisper, difficult to identify. Some experts believed it was radio interference. Others swore they heard one phrase, "He's back." This recording was never officially released, but it changed the course of the investigation. Hanlon, obsessed with answers, began connecting the dots. He discovered that the watch had been made by a man named Charles. Holloway, a watchmaker who had mysteriously disappeared in 1951 and who, curiously, lived just 20 miles from New Haven. Holloway was known for eccentric behavior, and his diaries spoke of experiments with temporal frequencies, an attempt to create a watch that not only kept time, but controlled it. Suddenly, the case stopped being just a string of murders and began to touch on something much deeper, the idea of manipulating time. Some investigators laughed at the theory, others took it too seriously. But Hanlon went further. He believed that someone, at some point, had figured out how to interrupt the natural flow of time within the house, and that the clock was the trigger, perhaps not scientifically, but symbolically, as if that object concentrated all the energy surrounding the deaths. By this point, the story had gone beyond the realm of research. It had become a personal journey for the detective, an almost spiritual search for a hidden truth. Hanlon began recording. Testimonies from neighbors who claimed to see lights flickering inside the house even after it had been sealed off. One child reported seeing the clock man watching from the window, and, most disconcertingly, one of the former residents revealed that, on the nights before the tragedies, the clock would move forward a few minutes, as if warning of what was to come. The detective tried to use this detail to his advantage. He installed cameras, microphones, and vibration sensors, all connected to a panel that monitored the clock 24 hours a day. For weeks, nothing happened, until one cold morning at 3:07 a.m., the clock stopped, and all the cameras shut down simultaneously. When they returned, something was different in the image. The minute hand wasn't in the correct position. It had moved backward, exactly 2.5 minutes. This anomaly gave rise to even stranger theories. Some scientists were consulted and suggested that the local magnetic field might have been altered. Others said it was impossible. But what everyone agreed on was that the clock was responding to something, perhaps presence, perhaps intention, perhaps fear. And the deeper Hanlon delved, the more the case seemed to engulf him. He began dreaming of the clock's sound, seeing shadows that weren't there. His wife reported that he woke at 3:07 a.m. every night without fail, until one day he simply vanished. His car was found just a few feet from the house, the engine running and the radio tuned to a constant hiss. The clock, the same one that had been in custody, was gone. Comment there. That makes sense to me. The truth is, every small town has someone who seems out of touch with time. The kind of person who lives at their own pace, as if the rest of the world were always moving too fast. New Haven, that someone was Arthur Bell, the man many believed to be the true culprit behind the clock-related murders. He lived just a few meters from the house where it all happened, in a narrow, ivy-covered residence that seemed frozen in the 1950s. Inside, time truly had a different meaning. Arthur was a retired watchmaker, known for his almost supernatural patience in repairing the most delicate mechanisms. But it wasn't just a craft. It was an obsession. He said that watches were the only creatures that never lie, and he spent entire days disassembling and reassembling gears, observing the movement of the hands as if reading a secret language. For him, every beat had a purpose. Every second was a symbol. After the first deaths, police began connecting the dots. Arthur was familiar with the model of the clock found in the house, a rare 1943 model manufactured by a watchmaking company he had worked for decades before. And most disturbing, in his private workshop, investigators found dozens of stopped clocks, all showing the same time: 7 in the morning. This coincidence immediately put him under suspicion. The man who dedicated his life to measuring time now seemed to have found a way to stop it, and as reporters approached his workshop, Arthur's figure took on almost mythical contours, at times a tormented genius, at times a cold, methodical killer. The town nicknamed him the man who controlled time, but what few people knew was that Arthur Bell had a tragic past. As a young man, he was married to a woman named Eleanor who died under strange circumstances. A fire destroyed the watch shop the couple ran, and reportedly Arthur narrowly escaped, carrying only a wall clock that survived the flames intact. He often said that the clock stopped the moment his world ended. The time: 7 in the morning. This information was never officially linked to the case, but it was enough to turn suspicion into certainty for the residents. The idea that he was somehow reliving that trauma in a cycle of deaths was the perfect fuel for fear. People began reporting seeing Arthur wandering the streets in the early hours of the morning, watching the house from afar. With a vacant stare, as if waiting for something to happen. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because more than a simple suspect, Arthur represented a mirror of human mind when it is consumed by pain and guilt. He spoke to the clocks as if they were people. He called each one by name. And for him, winding a clock was like bringing life back to something that time had taken away. This way of thinking was almost poetic, but also disturbing. During interrogations, Arthur never showed any fear. On the contrary, he seemed almost too calm. When asked why the clock stopped, he replied, "They don't stop, they just wait for the right moment to start again." This phrase was etched into police reports, and to this day, no one knows exactly what he meant by it. Some think it was a disguised confession, others that it was simply the delirium of a man who had lost everything. The detective Michael Hanlon, who was leading the investigation, began visiting him frequently. There was something about Arthur that intrigued him, a serenity that defied all logic. Hanlon believed that if the watchmaker were truly guilty, he wasn't acting alone. He saw the case as a carefully synchronized, almost choreographed sequence of events, and began to wonder if perhaps someone was manipulating Arthur, using him as a distraction. But the more the detective observed him, the more he noticed something strange. In every conversation, Arthur seemed to know what Hanlon was going to ask. He would answer before the questions were finished, with phrases that sounded almost rehearsed, but always laden with hidden meaning. During one of their meetings, the detective noticed that Arthur's pocket watch had stopped, exactly at 3:07. When he mentioned this, Arthur just smiled and said, "Time stops when it realizes it has seen enough." From then on, the story began to blur. The lines between reality and imagination blurred. Hanlon began to feel that time inside Arthur's workshop was passing. differently. One time he entered shortly before noon, and when he left, the sun had already set. But the wall clock still read 12:01. None of the other clocks worked. They all stood still, as if time refused to move forward while he was inside. This kind of experience shook the detective's mind. He began to question his own perception of reality. Reports he wrote reveal a curious pattern. On the nights he interrogated Arthur, Hanlon always woke at 3:07 at home, without knowing why, in some of those early mornings. I swore I heard the sound of a clock being reassembled, the creaking of gears, the light metallic ringing, the sound of a string slowly turning. Meanwhile, the watchmaker seemed increasingly at peace. When the case gained international attention and journalists surrounded his home, Arthur disappeared. The workshop was found locked, but inside, all the clocks were ticking at the same time, something no one had ever seen before. All synchronized, all ticking. ISO 7 spinning in circles, as if they were trapped in an endless cycle. This scene left the city in a state of collapse. It was as if time had become a living entity, responding to the command of someone who was no longer there. Hanlon began to study Arthur's life in search of an explanation. He discovered that he had worked for years at a company called Bell and Holloway, who manufactured experimental clocks based on magnetic variations. The same concepts investigated by Charles Holloway, the missing watchmaker. Mentioned earlier. Coincidence or fate, the two names met at the same point in the timeline. Some began to believe that Arthur had discovered a method of interfering with time. Others saw him as the victim of an ancient curse, one that began with Eleanor's death and was perpetuated through the clocks he repaired. There were even those who claimed he never really existed, that the clockmaker was a physical manifestation of time itself, a living metaphor, a projection of human pain and guilt. Of all the versions, none could erase Arthur Bell's impact on New Haven's history. After his disappearance, the house's original clock, the one that started it all, was found hanging on the wall again, working perfectly. But the second hand seemed to have changed. It rotated irregularly, as if hesitating before each strike. The sound was no longer the same. There were subtle pauses, small interruptions that made the listener uncomfortable, as if the clock were trying to breathe. And perhaps that's the scariest part of this story, the idea that time, when disturbed, finds its own ways to defend itself. And Arthur Bell, perhaps he was just the messenger. Write it down. I'm on that journey too. On that cold morning, fog covered the streets of New Haven like a thick veil, muffling even the sound of footsteps. The town clock tower read 3:06 a.m. when the main police car pulled up in front of the house. Inside, the lights flickered as if something were interfering with the electricity. The officers looked at each other in silence, each feeling a strange weight in the air, a sense that time was about to freeze. One of them said, almost in a whisper, "If I'm going to go in, let it be now." And it was at that moment that the familiar sound echoed from inside. Tick, tack, tick, tack. An irregular, hesitant, almost human rhythm. When the police broke down the door, the clock's hand was still moving. Slowly, as if struggling against something pulling it back. The crack of the wood's impact mingled with the sound of the wind rushing through the rooms. On the floor, in the center of the room, was Arthur Bell, lying on his side, his eyes open, his body still. The clock hanging on the wall ticked 7, and seconds later, in front of the police, He stopped on his own. It wasn't an electrical or mechanical failure. It was as if time had decided to end there, with him. The silence that filled the house was so dense it felt like screaming. One of the officers later claimed that, at that moment, he felt a vibration in the air, something unexplainable, as if the clock's sound continued even after it had stopped. None of the devices registered any abnormal activity, but they all reported the same discomfort, the feeling that they were being watched, that something alive was there. The forensic examination confirmed that Arthur had been dead for just a few hours. No sign of a struggle, no apparent injuries. The autopsy would later say his heart had simply stopped. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. What caught his attention was the daily found on his workbench. In it, Arthur had written a series of detailed notes about the clock's mechanisms, but the last line seemed more like a confession. Time doesn't kill, it just observes. It chooses who to stop, and today it chose me. News of the death spread quickly. Local newspapers ran bold headlines. The man who controlled weather dies at 3:07 a.m. Within hours, the house became a point of curiosity. Hundreds of people gathered at the gate, some in silence, others praying. It was as if everyone needed to witness the end of that story, even without understanding it. The investigation was officially closed weeks later. The case was classified as a natural death and closed. But internal reports told a different story. There were reports of unexplained interference at the scene. Equipment was malfunctioning. Officers' personal watches were simultaneously stopping at the same minute. And even cameras were recording distorted images, as if the air inside the house were thicker than normal. Time seemed distorted. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the outcome of the case was not just about Arthur Bell's death, but about the psychological and symbolic impact that he left on an entire community. After that night, nothing in New Haven was the same. The street where the house stood was closed off, and for months no one came near. People avoided even mentioning Arthur's name. It was as if time had left a scar on the city, a reminder that there are forces that cannot be measured or fixed. Long-time residents swear that in the following weeks, clocks throughout the neighborhood began behaving strangely. Some went forward, others went back, and some stopped completely, always at 3:07 a.m. Technicians were called, equipment was replaced, but the problem persisted. The phenomenon disappeared only months later, as if the city were trying to readjust to the passage of time. Meanwhile, Arthur's house was abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the garden was overgrown, and the clock, the same one that had stopped, was taken to a local museum, locked in a glass case. But to this day, visitors claim to hear a faint sound when they approach, tic-tac rhythmically, almost imperceptibly. Some say the hand moves for a second and then returns to its previous position, as if trying to start over again, but never succeeding. The detective Michael Hanlon, who followed the case to its conclusion, left the police force shortly thereafter. In a rare interview years later, he admitted that he still had nightmares. "Sometimes I dream I'm inside that house," he said, "and I can hear the clock breathing." This phrase became famous and was repeated by those who studied the case, as if the clock had become a symbol of something greater, a warning about the limits of human curiosity. Subsequent generations grew up listening to the story, and, as with every myth, it gradually gained New layers. Some said Arthur never died, that the body he'd found was merely an illusion, a kind of self-created surrogate. Others believed the watchmaker had achieved what he'd always wanted, to escape time. The most popular theory was that his soul was trapped inside the watch, watching, waiting for the right moment to start turning again. Most intriguingly, in 2003, a museum restorer reported that the glass in the clock's display case was cracked on the inside. Security cameras showed nothing. Unusual, but the crack formed a delicate curved line resembling the letter A. Arthur. Coincidence or not, the incident was enough to reignite debate about the case. And it is at this point that the story stops being just about crime and becomes about perception and transformation. Time in New Haven ceased to be a sequence of seconds and became an entity, something with a personality. People began to reflect on their own relationship with time, how much of it we waste, how much we ignore, how much we try to control. Perhaps this was Arthur Bell's true legacy, making an entire city face what it had always avoided. The house remains standing to this day, aged, covered in ivy, but intact. No buyer was interested, and attempts to demolish it failed for inexplicable bureaucratic reasons. Some say that every night a soft light shines in the second-story window. Some believe it's simply the reflection of a passing car. Others that it's Arthur trying to adjust the hands of time once again. Comment here, that makes sense to me. They say time is the only thing that never comes back, that everything it touches changes, ages, disappears. But is that really true? Or is it that in certain places, time simply chooses to observe, silently, patiently, waiting for the truth to come out? New Haven, this question has never been resolved. Decades have passed since Arthur Bell's death, and to this day, no one can fully explain what happened in that house. Some call it a curse, others a coincidence. But there are also those who believe the watchmaker discovered something that should never have been revealed. Some say that time is not a line, but a circle, and that Arthur learned to walk within this circle, traversing the same seconds over and over again, until he himself became part of the mechanism. The clock in the house, now kept under glass, is perhaps proof of this. There is nothing supernatural about it, at least not visibly. The gears work, the winding is intact, and the high sound optic tack, it's still the same as it was 40 years ago. But anyone who looks closely swears they see something different. A reflection in the glass, a shadow between the hands, as if something or someone still lived inside. Time in New Haven has never been the same. Older residents say the days seem shorter, the seasons blend, and the city's clocks slip with inexplicable frequency. Some believe Arthur left something trapped in that space, a kind of crack between what we understand as reality and what we prefer to hide. Others say he didn't die, simply freed himself from his body and merged with what he loved most, time. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because behind this story there is something that goes beyond fear or curiosity. There is a hidden truth about control and surrender, about how humans try to control the inevitable and pay dearly for it. Arthur spent his life trying to understand time, measure it, adjust it, make it predictable. But in the end, time refused to be understood. It simply watched, waited, and at the right moment exacted its price. This is the cruel irony of the human journey. The more we try to control the uncontrollable, the more we become its prisoners. The New Haven case became a living metaphor for the mastery mentality, this almost obsessive need to have answers to everything. The same one that makes people view mystery with fear, when in fact perhaps it's just trying to teach us something. Because if time really did stop inside that house, what did that say about the observer? Was the clock to blame, nor the mirror? Many scholars who revisited the investigation files point out something curious. The victims had nothing in common, yet they were all experiencing a moment of loss, guilt, or profound regret. It's as if the clock chose those trapped in their own past. People who, somehow, had already stopped inside, even if the hands were still moving on the outside. This is the darkest and most human part of this story. There's a line from one of the final statements by Michael Hanlon, the detective who investigated the case to its conclusion. He wrote, "Time does not take lives. It only restores what was interrupted." Maybe he realized something no one else did. Maybe he understood that time, in fact, doesn't stop. It's we who remain stuck in certain moments, reliving the same seconds, the same pains, the same fears. What if that's it? What if the real clock isn't the one hanging on the wall, but the one we carry inside? The one that sometimes insists on stopping at the exact minute something marked us forever. When a loss crosses our mind, when a decision changes everything, when the past keeps beating inside our head, even years later. It's at that moment that time ceases to be linear and becomes emotional. Arthur Bell, in some ways, lived this literally. He didn't just repair clocks, he tried to fix the time he lost. He tried to reverse what the world had taken away, and perhaps without realizing it, he crossed the line between the real and the impossible. There's a tragic beauty in this, the relentless search for one more second. 1 second to remake what can no longer be changed. This story leaves a mark on those who hear it because deep down we all have a clock we'd like to reset, a moment we'd like to freeze, a memory that still pulses as if it had just happened. And that's why somehow the mystery of New Haven has never ended, because it speaks to all of us about the time that passes, the time that is lost, and the time we insist on reliving. And perhaps this is the most important revelation, that time is not just something we measure, but something we feel. It may seem cruel, but it is also what gives us the chance to move on, to transform pain into memory, and memory into learning. Arthur, deep down, wanted to imprison time so that nothing would change. And he ended up becoming a prisoner himself. So the question remains that echoes in New Haven to this day: did time really stop? Or did someone know exactly when to do so? Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it's because something about this story captivated you. Perhaps the mystery, perhaps the atmosphere, or perhaps the feeling that time in some way was also watching you as you listened. And that's exactly why this channel exists, for us to dive together into these stories that blend reality, emotion, and the kind of hidden truth that time tries to hide. So, if this video made you think, shiver, or even look at your watch with a little more suspicion, subscribe to the channel. This way, you can continue following each new investigation, each story that challenges what we understand as real. Here, every detail matters, and the more we explore, the more time seems to reveal what it never intended to show. Oh, and leave a like so I know you were with me until the end. This really helps keep this journey alive and allows more people to discover this type of Content. And so I know you stayed this far. Comment there. I'm with you until the end. I want to see who really stayed until the last second of this story. Now, if you want to continue this immersion, there's a video here on the side that complements this line of mysteries, and I guarantee it will leave you even more intrigued about what time is capable of hiding. Click there and stay with me there.